Shalom and welcome to the Heartland Connection. This is Zach Waller, the Executive Director of Hayovel, your host, coming to you guys straight from the Heartland of Israel. Some really big news this week. The Cabinet of Israel has unanimously approved the proposal to recognize a community here in Samaria, Chavat Gilad, as an official community. The community was originally established in 2002 in memory of Gilad Zar, son of Moshe Zar, who was a security coordinator for the Shamron Regional Council, but he was actually killed in 2001. Gilad was, and so then Moshe Zar, his father, established this community called Chavat Gilad in 2002. For you guys that have been here on the harvest trips, you remember Rabbi Yonadav Zar. So this was Rabbi Yonadav's brother who was murdered, Rabbi Yonadav's father who established this community, Chavat Gilad. But it was, what they call an illegal outpost or whatever. He was just starting this on land, but apparently he had actually bought this land. So it wasn't like some of these hilltop settlements, they're just going out on military-owned land. It was actually land that he had bought. So several weeks ago, you may have heard about there was a rabbi named Raziel Shavach who was actually murdered, and he actually had lived in this community. He was killed a little while ago, unfortunately, in a very horrific terrorist attack there. But just this week, just like hours ago, as I'm doing this, as I'm recording this, so by the time you hear it on Shabbat, it'll be a few days old. But just reading an article, it says, presenting the proposal at the start of this week's cabinet meeting, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made the following remarks. A few minutes ago, I spoke with Yael, the widow of Rabbi Raziel Shavach. I told her that the entire nation and all members of cabinet embrace her and the children in their time of grief. I also asked her to hug the children for us. I told her that our policy is being carried out in two spheres. First, exacting justice. Yesterday, our forces were in action once again in an effort to apprehend the last of the assassins and other accomplices in the murder of Rabbi Shavach. We will not rest until we bring them to justice, and we will bring them all to justice. Our second policy guideline is to strengthen settlement. Whoever thinks that through the reprehensible murder of a resident of Chavat Gilad, a father of 6, that he can break our spirit and weaken us is making a grievous mistake. So this is really amazing. And just another picture of how the Jewish people, they don't respond with, the IDF could take, pretty crazy action, just go on and wipe out a whole town or, whatever. They could, out of, righteous indignation, one of their rabbis, this, very innocent guy who's living on, this area that's, this controversy, whatever, but, it gets murdered by these terrorists. It would be, you would think it would be very tempting to just go do something, very violent back, right? But the Jewish people's response is, okay, we're going to build more. And so they've recognized this community in the government as an official community. So that's really exciting for the Jewish people. Obviously, it's very sad how this had to come about, but it's exciting to see that the government of Israel is finally, recognizing the need for more stability in this area, and that the answer to peace and stability is to strengthen the settlements, not to remove them. So this is very, very exciting that this is happening now. And it's been really interesting here in the land of Israel, since President Trump's announcement that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, just stating the fact and recognizing that fact. There's been some pretty crazy response from, Palestinian leadership. And I don't know if you guys are following much of it, but there was a recent conference where President Trump basically said that, he was responding to these statements and very disrespectful, to put it lightly, comments from these Palestinian leaders. And he basically said, hey, the U.S. has given you guys millions of dollars. If we don't get some respect from you guys and some cooperation in working out real lasting peace, then we're going to cut the funding. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense for us to be giving you guys millions of dollars when you're not willing to work with us, when you're bad mouthing us and not respecting us at all. This doesn't make any sense. So it's like, wow, that actually does make quite a bit of sense. So it's exciting to see these things, because there's just so much that doesn't make any sense going on. And finally, when there's like some common sense happening, you're just like, wow, maybe there is, hope for the world. And just to give you an idea of what kind of dollar amounts we're talking about, I was just doing a little research and looking it up. And from one article I was reading, it says that overall, the United States is listed as providing $368 million to the UNRWA's operations, about a quarter of the agency's entire budget. So the UNRWA is the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, who's been designated to help the Palestinian refugees. Okay, so that would include Gaza, and also in Jordan, and also in the West Bank, right, in Judea and Samaria. And basically, the UNRWA their mission is to go in and try to help and provide humanitarian aid. It's ridiculous how much money and aid has been poured into these guys, and it hasn't really done anything to help. And it's very obvious if you really look at it closely that they're just using these refugees as pawns in their political agendas. I mean, if you look at if you put the Jewish refugee problem, so to speak, up against the Palestinian refugee problem, because there were Jewish refugees from all over the world. I'm talking about after the Holocaust, after persecution all over the world, there were Jewish refugees from everywhere. All the Jewish people that came flooding into Israel were all refugees. They were all getting kicked out of their land. They were fleeing some sort of crazy persecution, whatever, and they came into Israel. But somehow Israel just absorbed all these thousands of millions of people. And for some reason that just didn't happen with the Palestinians, with these Arab people who were here, who many of them left of their own free will. Israel actually asked them to stay in 1948, but they left of their own free will because they thought, we'll just get out of the way. After we win the 1948 war, then we'll just come back and be able to take our land and whatever the Israelis that we can when we come back and they're all gone. But obviously then Israel won the war in 1948 and they didn't have anything to come back to. And it was just all a big mess because, where was their house? They weren't here. So it made a really big problem. So just to give you an idea of what kind of money we're talking about here. So $368 million that U.S. is giving, quarter of their budget. And in addition to that, a congressional report from December 2016 stated that on average, ever since the Palestinian Authority's creation following the Oslo process in 1993, the United States has invested $400 million a year into the Palestinians, just into the Palestinian people. So now, add those two together, we're almost at $1 billion that has been given to this people group from the United States alone. That's not including any of the other countries that are, giving money to these people. So we're not talking about a small sum of money here that the U.S. is pouring into, and that Donald Trump is talking about pulling back. So the really exciting thing about this for me is it's another step in recognition that the two-state solution, or I like to call it the two-state suicide for Israel plan, is not a viable option. It's not a possibility. It's not going to work. It's not a peace process. It's not anything that's going to bring peace. I was recently watching a video debate between a Palestinian spokesman and Minister of Education in Israel, Naftali Bennett. And I love listening to him talk. He's so calm, cool, and collected, and just nails his stuff. But he was having this debate, and of course the Arab guy kept saying, I just want to see peace, and I just want to save the lives of the Palestinian children and their grandchildren, and we have to have this, two-state solution. We have to institute this thing. And then the minister Naftali Bennett just very calmly said, well, actually we tried that in the Gaza, and basically we got an Afghanistan as a neighbor. We're for peace, and we're willing to make great sacrifices for peace, but we're really just not willing to make another Afghanistan in our backyard in Judea and Samaria and just go ahead and commit national suicide. We're really not going to do that. So, he's just like, boom, just nailing it right out. And so that's what I think is exciting about this whole thing with President Trump is he's actually using some common sense. He's actually saying, hey, if you guys don't show respect to the United States, then we're not going to give you billions of dollars. Okay, that makes sense. So I'm excited to see that, and to see that we're seeing some support going to the settlements now with the official establishment of Chavat Gilad, this new community in Samaria. Some really amazing things are happening right here in the Heartland. And I think this whole idea really actually fits really well into this week's Torah portion, which this week's Torah portion is Mishpatim, which means judgments or ordinances, and we're in Exodus chapter 21, verse 1 through chapter 24, verse 18. And this Torah portion, we've just had the 10 Commandments, and now we're getting all these like more fine-tuned judgments. Okay, so some really defined commandments. Okay, this is what you do when this happens, and it's pretty detailed. And as I was thinking about all these things that are happening in Israel, and I was looking through this Torah portion, I thought, this is why the Jewish people are looked at the way they are, and the Arab Palestinians are looked at the way they are, is because of the way people look at this Torah portion. People in Western culture, this type of setup, that kind of culture, we really don't like to be told what to do, right? We're independent. We like to think for ourselves. We really don't like it if somebody even infers that we don't know what we're doing, or that we should be told what to do because we have it all together. And if we don't, at least we're going to look like it, and you better not question that. That's the kind of attitude that we have in the Western culture, especially in America, and I think in a lot of Western cultures. But here, in the Torah, in the Bible here, there's 613 commandments, and 365 out of those 613 mitzvot, the commandments, are thou shall nots. We have 365 times in the Torah that it says you shouldn't do this, and then the rest of them are you should do this. Right? 613 times we have God telling us what to do, and that really grates against our culture. Our culture is so anti-rules, anti-authority, anti-strong leadership. It really sets us up to not have any issue siding with a cause like the Palestinians, because the Palestinians, it's all based on what feels bad now, right? The Palestinian case feels bad now, right? It's like, I'm listening to this Arab guy in this debate. And he's like, I'm just, I just want to save lives, and I just want to, save my grandchildren and my children. And of course, Naftali Bennett brings that. He says, well, actually, the facts on the ground are that these Palestinian people are actually paying people to kill Jews, and so. It's like totally blown out of the water, his argument that he's trying to save lives. They're actually paying people to kill people for no reason, just innocent civilians. And so Naftali Bennett laid out, okay, they're paying this much for, this, and this much for that. And he laid it all out. And of course, the Arab was like, oh, that's all lies. You can't say that. And Naftali Bennett's like, well, I've got all the information right here. Anybody that wants to can find it. But that, it does. We don't have very much sympathy for that. It's like rules. It's like justice. It's authority. It's like strong leadership. It's, this feeling like, oh, well, these guys have this strong hand and they're oppressing the Palestinians. And so when the Palestinians say, oh, we're just trying to survive and we're being oppressed and we don't have this and we don't have that, and the Israelis are just beating us up and doing terrible things to us, and we just want statehood, we just want to be our own people, and we just want what Israel has and they won't give it to us. It feels bad, right? It feels like, oh, it's bad, and it's what's happening right now, so I have to aid them. And oh, if Israel's the giant, that's with the big club over them, then we got to attack Israel because they're the ones doing this bad thing. And a lot of times when we hear rules and regulations, we're just like, oh, these are rules and regulations, and here we go. Why does this matter? Why does that matter? What's really going on here? And so even to this Torah portion, we kind of get this feeling like, okay, it's just a bunch of rules. What's going on here? But I think it really does have a lot to do with how we view Israel and how our culture views Israel and the Jewish people. We just see them as these people who have all these rules and regulations, and we don't attach any kind of feeling or anything to that. But what's really crazy is, what happens, we can see a very clear picture of this in today's time. What happens when people try to decide on their own what is right and what is moral? If they put the Bible aside and say, hey, that's just old fashioned, all those rules of the Bible, they're, not really applicable in today's time, and it's ancient and it's old, and we're doing something new now, so we're going to figure out for ourselves what is right and what is moral. Then they have to start asking themselves, okay, so how do we determine that? And they say, well, let's see, what works. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is when a human tries to determine what works and what works well and what's right and what's moral, they always fall into what seems to work well for me, right? Which slides into us, selfish desires and what I think I need, what works good for me. And the reality is, a lot of wrong things feel good, right? A lot of wrong things feel good, and so those selfish desires can be played on that. And sometimes it maybe can even be easy to say, hey, well, what's really wrong with this? It feels good. And so obviously justice is then altered, and it slowly fades. It's not like all of a sudden some really extreme thing, comes in, but it's a slow fade, one thing after the other. And what do we see today? All of a sudden we have immorality rampant in our culture, and still people are not recognizing that we need God to show us what morality is, and that is what the Bible is. And so this week's Torah portion is showing us what morality really is. And I think we need to study these things out. We need to apply them to our lives. We need to not depend upon ourselves to try to figure out what's right and what's moral and what works. And what works for us might not work for somebody else. And we can't put that much responsibility on ourselves, because our selfish desires are going to come in and contort this to eventual immorality and to things that are wrong. And I think sometimes we may look at this because last week's portion we had this incredible scene where God Almighty is coming down on Mount Sinai, and there's a lot of feeling to it, right? You have the thunder and the lightning and the shofar that got louder, and that's so dramatic, and there's a lot of feeling, and it's like, whoa, I can really relate to that, and it really seems like this dramatic thing that would make a great movie or something, to have this experience. And then this week's portion is like, oh, it's rules and regulations. I was reading an article from a rabbi in the UK, Rabbi Sachs, and this is the way he put it. He said, Mishpatim, this week's Torah portion, with its detailed rules and regulations, can sometimes seem a letdown after the breathtaking grandeur of the revelation at Sinai, but it should not be. Last week's portion, Jethro, contains the vision, but God is in the details. Without the vision, law is blind, but without the details, the vision floats up in heaven. With them, the divine presence is brought down to earth where we need it most. So I read that again. Without the vision, the law is blind, but without the details, the vision floats up in heaven. With them, the divine presence is brought down to earth where we need it most. With these details, with these laws, all of a sudden we're able to learn about who God is, what righteousness is, what holiness is, what right is, what wrong is, and what morality is. And when that godliness is brought down to the earth, it's so beautiful, and there's such blessing comes from that. And so I was really inspired by that by that little quote there from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, just kind of showing how these two things really go together. These laws is really just as much God coming down from heaven as this dramatic thing that we read about in last week's portion of God, coming down His power. It's God's will. It's His way. It's His will that is being given in a way that it can work through us in this world. And it's so powerful. It's so amazing. So, and some of these things are difficult for us to really understand. We pretty quick in this Torah portion, all of a sudden we have the topic of slavery. And obviously, we have so many heroes in our mind who worked for the abolition of slavery and, to get rid of that and to bring freedom. And we know that was a really godly thing, and that, that the slavery was bad. And I think, what they're talking about here in the Bible as slaves and what we think of as slaves is two totally different things. If you really read this closely, on what exactly they're talking about and what the rules are around this, basically you're talking about people that couldn't make it on their own. They weren't able for whatever reason to make it on their own, and they needed someone to take care of them. And so basically this is a system where the people who need help can get help. So they just needed to work, and in return they would be taken care of. And just imagine in our world today, if all of our homeless people that are on the street got offered a comfortable bed to sleep on and healthy food to eat in exchange for helping out around the house, working whatever, and after 6 years they had the right to go free, right? That's what it talks about here in every seventh year. Then they could go free. And not to mention that every Shabbat, right, every Sabbath, they weren't allowed to work. And so really, who really owned these, was it their owners, the people who owned the slaves? Were they the ones who were really, or they were following God's will, and on Shabbat, on the seventh day, they had to rest. So this is something totally different than what we have in our minds. In our minds, we think of these kidnapped people who are, taken with force. And we see here in this Torah portion that the penalty for kidnapping is actually death. So we're definitely talking about something that's totally, totally different. And that this system is actually set up so that when Israel would come into good times, into prosperity, that this slavery would disappear, because you would no longer have people that needed that kind of help. They would be able to thrive without so much effort and work or whatever. So really, this whole setup is a setup that would eventually lead to to slavery being abolished, right? Even this kind of, you could say maybe healthier type of slavery where they're actually helping people. So just want to throw that out there. This is talking about something a lot different than what we might have in our minds. So then it talks about damaged property. It's really detailed on like these different things: theft, the borrower. In chapter 22, verse 13, some really just practical information here about what you do if, you're borrowing a tool or an animal or kind of like that. And it really applies in today's time. What do you do if you borrow something and it breaks? And so it's saying here in the Torah that it's different if they're with you, if the person you bought it from is with you or they're not. So this really provides some really practical information on how to work in community with each other. One thing that's really interesting here in chapter 23, verse 4, it says, if you find an ox or a donkey of your enemy, you shall return it to him speedily. And this is a really big deal for the Jewish people. If they find something that belongs to somebody else, they will go way out of their way to make sure and try to get it back to them. So then there's a lot of different stories that they tell about that. I don't really have time to get in that too much. It talks about the Shemitah in this portion. It's so awesome to see that the Jewish people are now trying to implement these type of things back into their society today, these biblical things. It's incredible. We have the feast, and I just want to throw out there too, and I've heard a lot of more Hebrew roots, Messianic type people talk about how, in Leviticus chapter 23, it says they're the feast of the Lord, and people are calling these the Jews' feast, and that doesn't make any sense. But actually, if you look in the book of John in the New Testament, chapter 5, verse 1, chapter 6, verse 4, and 7, verse 2, it actually says the feast of the Jews. So I think we have to acknowledge the Jewish people. It's okay. It doesn't have to take away from our identity to say that these are the feast of the Jews. They earned it. They're God's people. We can call it their feast. Thank you guys so much for listening, and Shabbat Shalom from the beautiful, exceedingly good land of Israel.
Restoration.